announce the day open for the value-added course for today. With the permission of the chair, may I do so? Thank you to the chair. So today we have a special guest who is going to speak on Vedic age, with special reference to the economics and the society as well. So thank you for to the chair for granting me the permission to open this session. So I will use this opportunity to introduce my speaker, that is Dr. Prem Mishra. Uh, Sir, Dr. Prem Mishra sir has did his MPhil and PhD from Jawaharlal Nehru University, a very prestigious university of Delhi, and he did his PhD from West Asian Studies and MPhil from West Asian Studies. He did his bachelor's in economics from Patna University and PG diploma in journalism. So and has authored many articles, books, and had made several book reviews as well. So he has shown his keen interest in studying West Asia, Islam, Orientalism, and the Western discourse on the Muslim world. The impact of U.S. Rebalancing Act after the Gulf uprising, and has a special interest on Orientalism, which I get from his CV. So he is contemporarily working in Jamia Millia Islamia at the Center for Nelson Mandela Center for Peace Building and Conflict Resolution, and as an assistant professor. Previously, he was working in UNICEF Business Standards and uh, Gorodilla Prakan Sarvajik Vikas Sangh, and Indian for he has also worked in Indian Policy Foundation (IPF). So, without wasting any time, may I request Professor Prem Mishra to come on stage, and Prem Anand Mishra sir to come on stage and deliver a lecture on Vedic age. So, welcome, sir. I am extremely grateful to welcome you, and it's a privilege that you are here. Through your lecture, we are interested to know what was Vedic age, why it was known as Vedic age, and the ontology and the epistemology of the topic. So, matlab, clubbing many things together, I know it will be very difficult for you, but still, we are keen to know what was Vedic age, how economics and social dynamics altered during the Vedic age. So, without wasting any time, sir, over to you, Dr. Prem Mishra, sir, with the permission of
Yeah.
the chair. Thank you.
Am I audible to you? Am I audible to you?
You're audible, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, sir.
Yeah, thank you at the outset before I speak, and thank you for your handsome introduction. Also, just to mention that I'm just coming from the lecture, and it is a working day. But thank you for this opportunity to interact and share my ideas and views on a very important topic. Topic as per se itself is, as you see that the vastness of any subject like this, any such a short period of time is at times it would be like it's not very proper way of investing or inquiring about the subject. But considering the time limits and considering the vastness of the subject, what I'll do is to try to make a sort of a meaningful interventions, bringing some sort of an academic understanding on the subject, and try to bring that some sort of a connection between why the subject is so important, not just from the purview of a civil services, but in terms of the entire knowledge of the past. As you know that history is not just mere about the occurrence of events, but it is also about that a lens through which you can inquire about the past, and also your own interconnections. Who are we? That the very existing still question comes from this idea that basically is a sort of an inquiry that we try to historicize. There are many sort of things. Initially, just wanted to make a sort of a brief discussions on this, and logically, I'll go into the details of it. First is that any such discussions and inquiry required some sort of a very competence, and that's it, that whether can you inquire basically about ancient past and Vedic past without knowing too much about the language of that period. uh, I'll come to the discussions about these things. I'm trying to make a brief note about things so that this lecture should have some sort of a very uh, epistemologically is a very much like creative in one sense, and at the same time analytically, that how we can analyze those events and try to make some sort of a meaningful way of understanding the subject. Second is very important that by training, if you are a historian or not, and do you have the language understanding, you have the archaeological understanding, physiological understanding, and many such things like that, even anthropology for that matter. Basically, it means is that for any sort of epistemic understanding about the past, particularly if I say here about the Vedic age, you need to have a very much a disciplinary understanding, and those disciplinary boundaries cannot be reduced with such with just the limitations of history. You need to have a, and that's why economy and society, when we say economy and society, it's a very much closely linked, it's like interdependent with each other. That for any such of inquiry about any sort of past or any geography or any society, these are important sort of nomenclature. Second, I would like to say that there is a distinction between the history and the past. uh, History is basically inquiring about the past. The separation between the two, at many scholars, particularly in West, in Jenkins and others, even in Indian historians like Thapar and others, have tried to make sense that you cannot bring the past back. You can only inquire with the level of methodological discussions you have, wherein some historians, whether particularly who have been invested in a Marxist scholarship, try to use historiography, and similarly the others try to see philology, Max Muller and these people, Indologist in particular. Second sort of in a competitive argument would be here that how the scholarship has really been developed. Before getting into all sort of the idea, how do we really relate that? Two things are very important, that if we try to investigate and discuss about the discussions here, the information by is overwhelmingly present before us. We can look into Google and we can get the information about what sort of small information about that period was. But for people like who are into academia, it is more important that how we can bring that sort of epistemic understanding. Also because in if we try to make sense about the Vedic history, are we talking about ancient India first? Second, are we talking about that the very religious connotations of that period? And third, we can also say that the rival views and sort of a different sort of discussions about that. So the past and history some sort of becomes a rival at one point. Second is that if you have limited options about getting into the language of that time, or anthropology and archaeology is very important in that sense. The entire based argument you have is an intellectual history basically, and any intellectual history which invested into some sort of an epistemic notions try to see that from which lens and purview that we can inquire. There are two set of discussions are very important here, that from the actuality of the present or from the current standpoint, if we try to look into the past and particularly Vedic age, we have range of scholarships available, from the Marxist, non-Marxist, from the Indologist, from the Orientalist, and also from that matter alternative history that we now talk about. And sometimes we also call it very much Hobbes, Hobsbawm's and these people as historians argue invented history, try to make sense that there is some sort of an ontological reality whenever we talk about these times about the past, and there is a continuity of it. Such complexities when you have and try to give it a sort of a proper inquiry, it itself is a very tough task to say first. Second aspect that I want to tell you that any epistemic inquiry, basically epistemology about that, what is knowledge, how we know what we know, and all this sort of discussion. But any discussion about without having ontological reality, the nature of its being, that from where it really came from, how it really came from, and then only you can create a knowledge about any aspect. To best of the scholarship, particularly in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, there was a lot of Western understanding about India's past. So there is always a challenge before when, and these are important discussions, by the way, that how do we really know our own past, or is there in some sort of a continuity? One way you can say that Vedic is that we still read, and we read make some sort of a connections, close connections here, is also because this is the only in a geography, one may say, or in terms of linguistically, one may say, and the some sort of a societal and religious, particularly, there is an ontological connection between thousands of years and all. No other civilization, by the way, has some sort of a similar continuity that what we somehow have. Whether Egyptian, Mesopotamian, whether in terms of Sumerian, it's lost. Similarly, whether it's early biblical understanding about Judaism and that aspect, lost tribes and everything, there is a lost things. Here, there we see that there is a too many of informations are available. There is some sense that in religious connotation there is a continuity about the Vedic past, and that sometimes makes it very challenging. That are we, when we try to from the present try to look into those Vedic period and try to see, are we not falling into the trap of many conversations? There is a possibility, and has been shown by that, that there is a unnecessarily lot of sort of two set of extreme view that we know about Vedic past, whether it's Vedic mathematics, whether it's marriages during that time, the Varna system, whether the the pre-agricultural society of the Vedic period, the ritual and practices, the aspect of particularly the what we know the caste system now, and in terms of the language, and in terms of that sort of a connection, we have some sort of two extreme views. The one view is try to glorify of that past and try to see, is which comes from the Veda itself, that all the best thing comes from wherever should be allowed, that sort of thing. And the knowledge is not restricted. Second is that if there is a glorification of the Vedic past, there is also a sense of ridiculation. Now, in two extreme views, when you have, which is at the present, try to look into the Vedic age, and that is very important, whether from any purview, one can say, or any lens for that say. But for any academic inquiry, it's very important that what sort of a competitive view try to analyze the subject, and can the subject itself speaks for itself through some sort of its various disciplinary understanding that we say. One important aspect, another is a very important understanding of Vedic, that most of our understanding is comes from the reactions to that. That India never had that sort of a very scholarly documented history of Vedic period. As we know that Vedic period had also very much invested at two levels. One is the Shruti as a parampara, which we call some sort of a divine revelation that we call, and Veda is an inheritant of that, Shruti parampara. And the similar other aspect is the aspects of smriti, through which we somehow try to see in Puranas, and sometimes even in Upanishads and other aspects of it. So between the Shrutis and the Smritis, we try to see that how do we really understand about our own past. Particularly when we say our own past, it's very much that current India and its geography is not just about Vedic history. It has its own civilizational understanding. So Vedic age is not first current India. It's also not about that Hinduism in terms of religious connotations that we talk about, but it talks about a very much a vast civilizational understanding, or any historical understanding of civilization requires some sort of a continuity, ontological continuity of value system, and that value system which used to exist in somehow continue to add through practices and rituals in current day also. So this is very important, that when we discuss about the Vedic history, we very need to be very cautious about it cannot be a geographical located understanding of current understanding of India. Also, it cannot be about that current understanding of linguistic or some sort of ritualistic, or in one sense with some sort of I can say that very much important say that the Brahminical understanding about history in that sense also, because it's all about civilizational. When we say civilization is very important at two things. One is that it is not just about cultural expressions, it is also not about the intellectuals or the intelligentsia or the elite that, as Matthew Arnold argue about civilization, the best that has been thought and said or understood. Different people have discusses about civilization differently. Huntington, when he discusses about class of civilization, gives culture as a what's very primordial concept. But we know that civilization has many connections and interlinkages. And one of the linkages, a very important purview, is the lived history. A lived history is basically about the experiences and subjectivities of the past of that period. And that's very much important, overall sort of a bringing this aspect and situating this idea that this is what when we try to understand about it. Second important aspect is that what sort of a scholarship that has really understood Vedic history. Initially, like I touched upon briefly about the Orientalists, particularly Max Muller and range of such people like who try to bring that sort of an idea, in some sense that try to look to early India or Vedic history of India in a civilizational sense, not in a nation state centric idea, is that India never had a very much a kind of a recorded, documented, proper historical, understanding of its past. So, as Alistair Johnston and these people argue about that, if you really want to know the past, you need to have a canonical text. Through that idea of a canonical text at one level, and second, when you separate between the past and the history, and third, when you have to give a proper response that no, it's not true, India has been a ontologically continuous civilizational in terms of its value, and history somehow connects on all those some sort of a core periphery understanding about culture, history, civilization, languages, food habits, ritual practices, religious feelings in terms of hierarchical order, trade practices, marriages for that matter, and all sorts of discussions that we know. So all these things somehow connects about at another level. uh, and in that period, out of reactions in a way, it was a proper inquiry about the Indian scholarships also. So we say there are two set of different sort of inquiries started. There is a Marxist understanding which based upon its early Indian history on historiography, whether Professor Romila Thapar, similarly R.S. Sarma, similarly Kosambi, and range R.C. Majumdar, and Nilkant Sastri for the southern part, and similarly any textbook if you take, the scholarship try to see from a historiographical point of view. Second, which is very important within this aspect on the Vedic age and Vedic history, is that do we have some sort of a very substantial information? What exactly when we can locate it? Now that becomes a very challenging. One challenge was that Orientalism and Orientalist lens try to give a picture that India does not have a proper inquiry about its own history and past. So everything, whatever they say, is basically about sort of a false history, or for that matter, it is somehow can say invented history. Or one may argue also that it does not have some sort of continuity in that sense, which it really claims, and it is not that civilized that is used to claim. So that sort of an argument, and in that response that a lot of different historians try to argue and try to locate. Now another very important, when we say Vedic age, what basically Vedic age we talk about? Do we have a very clear understanding about which period? Conservative idea would say that 1500 BC to 500 BC was that, but there are competitive and different diverse opinion on that. That when you have some sort of anthropology which every second year dates different period to Harappa civilization or Indus Valley civilization, which two are very important when we say about Vedic period, because we don't have a lot of other things. that in which manner, whether it's a climate or other regions that it really ended, or whether what sort of a language is very important to understand what exactly they used to say, what sort of practices they were early form of Hinduism that we talk about and try to justify some sort of a religious continuity. Second, we try to say what sort of languages they used to speak. Are they used to speak Sanskrit? A lot of different view have come of that. It's a very Indo-European language. So the Aryan theory comes in and try to see that Vedic history is not something, is a very core value. It is comes with competitive view about Aryans and non-Aryans theory that also come in. And these are unsettling understanding. Any inquiry in early India try to dates back, as I said, what the Vedic period is basically Vedas. First is what is Vedas and what are the Vedic ages basically. As I said, the Shruti and Smriti, that sort of a discussion. So it is a basically the encyclopedia of human wisdom. Vedas is basically, in a very simple foundational understanding, can say that it is basically the encyclopedia of human wisdom which comes from divine sources. Now, the divinity as a source makes it some sort of a compelling region that the Veda was not something about just about human society. There is a lot of divine interventions used to be, and that from that particular aspect of divine aspect, which we sometimes used to call the collections of wisdom or encyclopedia of wisdom in Veda, and then divided at four levels, where the Rig Veda, the Sam Veda, the Yajur Veda, and Atharva Veda, and try to see from economic and history in culture, religion, and these practices. That's very important. So how do we really know exactly? First is that Veda is basically encyclopedia of human wisdom. It's a divinity of source. At the same time, any idea of the past, and particularly a religious continuation of the past, works at three level, whether through canonical text one may say, or through from the lens of civilizational point of view, or historical overview one may say. It's always tried to divine at three levels. One is that divine understanding of the past, where the God and the human relations were very important, which is very much a core value in Vedic history, particularly in entire Vedic age, pre and the post both. Second is that when the society becomes more urbanized, then the notions of jurisprudence or the do's and the don'ts. And third, about the lived history, where a lot of narratives comes, a lot of storytelling comes, a lot of folk stories come. So that lived history comes at three levels, and these three four levels connects the civilizational understanding. And that's why there is so much of competitive, diverse, different scholarship, orientalist, non-orientalist, non-western scholarship, Marxist scholarship, non-Marxist scholarship, alternative history, try to locate different things. Do we have a settlement about exact locations? The answer is that it is still not settled, that exactly, because Indus Valley civilization and Harappa civilization that we talk about Vedic ages is also somehow makes its own story. That there is, every time there is an anthropological and other discussion comes, it again go back to 1,000 years back. So conservatively we can say 1500 BC and 500 BC, but there are different sort of discussions on that. So it itself is not settled in a manner that what exactly the Vedic age was. Some may say that the idea of kalpa, in a very much in a Sanskrit traditions, that goes into millions and millions of years. So we really don't know about that historical conservative idea. It's called 1500 BC and 500 BC in a very sort of a recorded understanding. There are different understanding, which you can say non-Marxist understanding, where P. N. Oak and these people discusses about that Veda is not basically 1500 BC old story. It goes back to since the human understanding about anything. It's not about human nature worshipping or that aspect, but it talks about many other levels. It's about all human spheres of life, and Veda really somehow denotes that. So there is a chronology in which that when we say 1500 and 500, the first the Rig Veda, then the Sam, then the Yajur and Atharva. There are many scholars argue that there are not, these are the only four category. The other Vedas that we do not talk about is basically lost, because we did not have some sort of tendency of keeping historical records. As we say that these Vedas are poetic in expressions, music, poetry, and most of the divine sources, particularly when we talk Vedas, where comes from the Shruti Parampara. So it's basically that continuity through that how you really memorized, and through generations as after generations, through mantras and shlokas, these things really continued. That is very much an important aspect. So many scholars say that Ayurveda, or for that, even for that matter, Mahabharata and all this is a part of the Vedas itself. So there is no direct, very bordered understanding that these are the only four, 1500 to 500 BC, the only conservative. It's some sort of an evolving in process, like any political concept. It is not frozen in times, but for our own limitations, that we talk about that this is what Vedic period was, and how do we really understand them. Now, second aspect, broader understanding of it, that what sort of society and what of economic relations that used to exist. So when I say that history is very much important, not as an occurrence of events, but it also about the lived history of the people and its different interconnections with nature, with fellow ones, sort of a societal understanding, the role of divine interventions and all that aspect. That becomes very important from where this economic and society comes. Now, whatever I have discussed so far, it is very important, indirectly, without getting into the economics and the society, that which society we talk about. Do we have a proper discussions and inquiries on that? Do we, when we say about the current standpoint and going back to the past, and try to look into that these things are still very much, because one way can say finally that we are the only way to inherit this of ontological reality of the Vedic period, with its different discussions. At Dinkar and other peoples have said that India and Indian early sins have a different sort of dimensions, where different sort of, it's a kind of a potpourri of mixed culture. We don't know even the Aryan, non-Aryan theory that we are Indo-European in one sense, coming from Siberian understanding of that sense, or the Dravidians were the true inheritors here. That's separate debate, because that's basically a sort of a going into the flux. That when we talk about the society and economy, are we talking about the in some sort of a pastoral agriculture society of later Vedic pages, or do we talk about that Aryan and non-Aryans also between that economic and society? Those unsettling realities, particularly when we investigate epistemologically, and try to analyze from a historical lens, it's a very difficult, basically, task. What we can do and which have been doing is that whatever the scholarship has been done, and through the channels of different analysis, we try to give us some sort of a proper meaning. And those meanings say that one way that these are the overarching understanding of Vedic period. There are the different phases where these were recorded through the hymns, through the shlokas, through the rituals and the practices, and that sort of thing. What basically the nature of society was that time was. And we say that is there any sort of a continuity? Any inquiry for that matter has to have some sort of a connection with the present. That's why make some sort of a kind of a meaningful exercise. And also how we can provide a different epistemic template on which we can somehow provide an authentic meaning of Vedic age and its continuity and real interconnections with our present. And in that way, economics and societies are very much an important discussions. But when we talk about economy and society of Vedic ages, we have to be very cautious. Are we talking about very organized understanding? Because economy is not just about a system of exchanges. It has to have some sort of an organization, some currency system, some taxation system, and all those things are in a very different sort of a view that we have about Vedic ages. So when we talk about the economy and the society, both its meaning somehow gets missed out, particularly in Vedic ages, particularly in early Vedic ages for that matter, that it is a very pastoral society where the cattle was not just was the center of major source of wealth, uh, or for that matter those who have, it's like that anybody who controls now capital is the basically the most blessed ones. Vedic ages society and even economy for that matter, the cattle was basically the most centered around with the whole polity governance, and basically it's a early phase of different sort of a tribal understanding, where nature worshipping and all these things we find, where the hymns for natures, like particularly the sun god and these gods, more prominent in Rig Vedas. And later only we see that the organized understanding of the different gods and semi gods which comes later. So economics of society, if we have that sort of a kind of a understanding of economics and society, then somewhere we will lose the meaning basically. So it was basically, let's, four five things, that it was a pastoral one. The cattle was the most centered around where the society and economy, particularly the role of cows and the horses. It was Society was not found iron in early Vedic phases. The copper was the basically main source. The barter system was the main exchange of economic ideas. And those who used to control or have a more cattle under their belt used to be more sort of an elite and rich people, and all those sort of used to give them a prominence. Uh, so economics and society, making a cultural point, was very much interlinked. It is not like organized that when we discuss about economics and society. So the society used to be is early form of pastoral when we say that agriculture was not that was strongly present in that sense. So what sort of food that habits they used to have, and we say that there was some sort of barley, when we say that rice plugging was started in early phases, but it was a pastoral one. So we saw that animal eatings for that matter was also prevalent in many ways. But that was when we say animal eatings and all those of things, since it was a source of wealth itself. So the cow becomes some sort of a very important in one, that the sacrificing it was a problematic since then. It's not a something that when we discuss about become a identity in one way. It always used to be that the source of most important human wealth was cow in Vedic ages in that sense. And that's why there is a sort of, when we discuss about narratives and everything, there is so much of discussions about it, because it was a pastoral one. There is a cattle society, there was no agriculture. And later on, when the agriculture society developed, when the iron was discovered, when the rice plugging all started in different phases of agricultural and urbanization started, we say that there are different sort of economic values also translated. So the feudalism started. The hierarchy, the Varna system which used to exist in Vedic ages was not that organized. Different scholarly points out that it was not that very strict order of Varna system which we find in later Vedic ages, where the Brahminical order, where the Kshatriya, the Sudras, and Vaishyas were as organized in that sense. It is basically with some contestation. Some may argue that somehow can be contested. Whatever the discussions have so far is that it is not very strict sense in that sense the Varna system that we talk about, particularly in the late Vedic ages. That in a family there used to be different sort of discussions. One used to be invested in rituals, one invested in some sort of economic practices, some sort of used to be in human affairs. So within a family there was no organized meaning of varnashram. Basically, the notions of clans and these things have been always in any society, but in early Vedic phases there was no defined understanding of clanship and all these things. It only become when the agriculture society became developed, society became more organized. We found that somehow the later Vedic ages somehow create some sort of an order. So the birth that used to be not some sort of a very strict meaning of varnashram became more sort of an hegemonic, ordered understanding in later Vedic ages, where the all sort of caste system, which we now talk about caste system or the Varna system of that time, it's become gradual process. It was not something that always existing in reality. And whatever we know from now, And that somewhere it is true because human society develops into some sort of gradual process in making. So tribal, then primitive to the tribal, from the tribal to some sort of a feudal society, from feudal society to some sort of an agriculture organized society, then the nation state and beyond. So these different phases of things, so when we look back about the caste system, that also we need to be very cautious that do Vedic ages was all about the same that what we came later, and that became more organized with the passing phases of human history. So that was a thing. Second, sort of the sources about, in the economics and society that we talk about, it's also about that, what sort of social aspects of life that was. So the marriages becomes very important in that aspect. Status of women became very important in that aspect. Status of, hierarchical meaning of, even if it is early tribe and non-organized and early feudal society, what sort of, human interaction used to be there, what sort of trade practices used to be there. We see there was a barter system, where there was no currency system was involved, there was no taxation in strict sense, we know. The marriages was very much a sort of a both, a status of women was, even whatever the historical overview has found, that the status of women was not bad. It was uh, equal in some, at least in terms of normative sense. Whether in practices what used to happen, it's very difficult, and try to find out is very difficult, because we can know the history, we can't know the past. But whatever we know, the status of women was quite almost similar between men and women. They have their choices when it comes to marriages. Later on, we see that the marriages and becomes very strict notions. After all, when the hierarchical and the, varnashram become very strict, we see that the marriages became also somehow some sort of falling into the trap of these sort of very strict varnashram system. That also become part. Similarly, economic practices and trade practices later on, they try to find a different meaning. Earlier, it was a barter system, or for that cattle and other wealth exchanges. We see that there was a different sort of discussion. When there was a discovery of iron, there was a discovery of proper agriculture discussions. We find that early Vedic pages and post-Vedic Vedic ages have a kind of a different thing. Society also now, religion or religious practices was equally very important in which we understand a society, particularly society, and some form of economic meanings to it. That what's all of, religious practices and ritual practices used to exist in a society. So apart from that, we know that the nature was the most supreme force of human interaction. So the nature was simple, somehow existing in reality. That particularly sun god or air, or and that's all. When we call that Indra or Varuna, and these are more important prominence they found in early Vedic Rig Veda in particular. And later on, when we find a different idea of gods comes. So the rituals and practices also have a sort of a different meanings. And we see that it later on, some form it really maintains its order, some form it really changes its ability in terms of different idea. Similarly, the, marriages, as argued, later on became sort of a polygamy. It's not polyandry, but polygamy was existing in some sense. The food habits, we say that in some form there were that people used to eat some sort of a form of non-agriculture, or one can say that animal sacrifices was present, like it's present even into the day, that there was a in some sort of offering to the god in some sort of an exchange. So the human sacrifice, animal sacrifices have always been in that, whether in early Vedic pages and post Vedic pages, and that remains sort of in a continuity in terms of ritualistic practices, if we try to look into that. So, in one way we can say the economic and the society was always somehow jostling around some sort of a new scope and meaning, where a society which was early agriculture phase, which society which does not have a very organized meaning of, different geography and other aspects of it, try to make meaning sort of a thing. But what we see now, even in the late Vedic ages, there was a practices of some sort of aspect. So when the iron was found, and later on we see that some sort of gold and some sort of that currency used to become, it became more formalized. Similarly, when the economy becomes organized and formalized, society became also formalized. Once the economy and the society which intermingle become organized, we see a different sort of order in the society started existing. So the political order, the clanship and becomes later on became sort of a very strict. And we see that out of these sort of a different progress of economics and society, a political order and especially the social order was created, which we call varna system, later on caste system. Once it became a caste system and all that aspect, we see that the role of economics becomes more feudal in characteristics, where one set of, we can say, the brahmins were given some sort of a because four aspects since the earliest time always was very important: the dharma, the kama, the moksha, and then one more. And these things are very much like very important aspects of what we call the understanding of Hinduism in that sense. But Vedic religion and Hinduism are somehow connected and somehow not. So that is very much an important when we say, but there is a continuity in that phase. So once religious understanding of economics and society is equally very important, that what sort of practices that people used to have, and later on these discussions really reaches out to a different levels when it becomes more organized. So economics and society was between pre and the post organized way of understanding it, and that's where we gives us a sense about what sort of Vedic age that we talk and discusses about. In similar way we can say, when these intellectuals try to argue about it, that when we discusses and separate uh, the phases on which that human society really progressed, it becomes very much and compelling for us that no society and culture was frozen and like furniture in the room. It was always an evolving. So economics and society at one level, even its non-organized manner, was a very important inquiry about knowing about the Vedic ages and its past, our past history, we can say that. But at the same time, there are different contestations, different alternative meanings to when we say about it. This is very important. What are the limitations in which we know through the lens of economics and society? Is that still there are many things are still left out about the language of particularly the Mohenjo-daro and Indus Valley civilization. Many things are still, we know that what is happening in different parts, in particularly in northern India. We try to excavate through some sort of physical anthropology and archaeology, and we try to make sense that what sort of society we had. So one three four major recommendations and points, if I may say, that one is that there is a continuity in process about the scholarship itself about Vedic age. Second is that there is always some sort of a continuity of ontological reality of the past and its connections with the present. Third, whatever the historiography, intellectual history, from the lens of religion, culture, society, language, archaeology, anthropology have been done, is still bring some sort of a new value about our past and history. And lastly, in terms of that, even if we try to make an alternative history and try to see that there is a complete continuity, some sense it is fine, but some sense it becomes very problematic, because if we try to give the Vedic history in Vedic ages from a very strict nation state centric, which basically Orientalist idea, we didn't have a proper new epistemology in inquiring about Vedic age. So, final point would be that there are a range of factors through which I try to analyze by using economics and society in a very pre and the post organized meaning, where the religion culture were intermixed. There was no separation like today when we saw about economy and the society and the culture, and it was not like that in that time. So these are basic things. There is a further scope of different inquiries has been done. There are different competence are required on that, and these are subject like that which takes at least years and years to somehow find that can we have a possibility to bring that Vedic history and Vedic ages and try to make some sort of a meaningful discussion of our actuality of the present and give it a kind of a non-Western template and try to that the responses should not be reactionary in measure, but then we have the sort of a channels and the template of creating a new epistemology, that whatever the discussions have been so far done, it should not be completely rust aside, but take some sort of inspirations from all sort of sources. And that's what Veda was basically all about. The sources of all knowledge should be welcomed. I think I have taken almost like 45, 50 minutes. I'll stop here. And if something through some discussion comes, I'll try to respond. I'll stop here in my whatever little I could try to gather, because it's a very vast and many aspects. But try to give some sort of a meaningful understanding about what exactly Vedic age from historical point of view and non-historical point of view. Uh, I'll just invite Dr. Khwaja to come and just take the proceedings further. I'll stop here. Thank you. Dr. Khwaja, can you hear me? Is Are you there? Uh,
Okay, I can hear you, sir.
are you there, Dr. Khwaja?
Yes, I am here. I am here, sir.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
So, yes.
thank you, sir, for such an enlightening discussion. Now, with the permission of the chair, may I declare the question answer session open? Thank you to the chair. The all the attendees are requested to ask the question by typing it on the comment box, and I will be reading it out to Dr. Prem Mishra, and he will be answering them. So, any questions, anyone, you can ask. So, in the meanwhile, I will be taking an opportunity to ask one question from you,
Yeah.
Dr. Prem Kumar Mishra, sir. Sir, can you throw some light on the historiography with a special reference to the Vedic age in relation to the Weitzman burden theory? Means how Weitzman burden theory influenced the historiography in covering the Vedic age. So, if you can
Um,
throw some light,
yeah, yeah.
thank you, sir.
See, as I said, briefly touched upon that most of the discussions as a the scholarship becomes very much like two set of ideas. That whatever the historiography has been done, the episteme was basically about a very Orientalist. When we say Orientalist, it doesn't mean that any Western sources has to be completely brushed aside. But yeah, I mean, history can be written by non-inhabitants also. But at the same times, when it becomes a sort of colonial lens to that, a power-centric idea of knowledge system, then it becomes a very problematic. Uh, there are historiographers who try to, debunk those, sort of a burden aspect. But when we know that, Orientalist is not just like survived through its infrastructure in a physical sense, but in terms of a very non-physical sense. So whatever the, Western epistemology about Indian history and its past has been, has to be very carefully read. One way the Indian historians have tried to see at two levels. That one way they try to bring its own subjectivity, try to look into from their own template, like Oak and Koshambi and these people. But there are Marxist historians which try to bring that sort of a Western episteme also already, because what historiography basically talks about. It talks about what is the scientific understanding of the past. How could you create the scientific understanding of the past? Basically, through the different disciplines. What are those disciplines? Disciplines are basically, anthropology, archaeology in particular, philology in that aspect, the language and all that, and try to see from anthropological view of understanding about the past, and try textual for that matter, psychoanalysis. When the Dongier's work on Hinduism becomes controversial, it was not historical overview of the Hinduism per se. that a lot of people try to challenge her. But she is not something that has not done a good work. But one of the problem that what sort of a lens you use. So when we say white burden, it's not that something that when we say we need to somehow delink also without falling into the trap which we call orientalism in reverse. So that anything which has been done by the white, or for that matter in the colonial past, which we carry forward through some sort of a knowledge productions, cannot be brushed aside. But at the same times, it should not be the response in a reactionary that we are the only way that we can know about our past and history. So historiography is a very scientific in nature, but it has its own limitations, and it must be open to different aspects. One problem which really continuity with the burden aspect is the ideological overview of the history. So every restricted understanding of historiographer, that they'll argue that they whatever understanding they have is the final truth to that. So that's why in nowadays a lot of historians challenges the Marxist understanding about history in past. And it some became more noisy when they go into and try to see about whether that early Indians used to eat cows or not, and all these things. But that is not all about Vedic ages. We need to be very much, somehow coming out of all these things. So historiography has its own like a burden aspect, but at the same time, there should not be Orientalism in reverse in that process. So somehow situating that aspect, there is a one aspect is very important, which is called intersubjectivity. So the question that we know our own past, how do we know basically? One way that we know our own past, which is continuity, is the form of different languages and ritual and practices in every aspect. But if we try to see into inquire about it, need not necessarily, it has always been since thousands of years. So it's a kind of a betting, the battling between epistemological rivalry. What we somehow fails to achieve is that create a some sort of a very new epistemology without falling into the trap of Orientalism and reverse. So in a one way, we try to continue with the burden aspect, particularly where the historiography has been done on it. At the same time, to look into the alternative history or somehow invented history, we also do not provide a proper epistemology which can provide an authentic challenge to that Orientalist lens, which is really somehow heavily present in major historical understanding of the past, particularly without much discussion, particularly in a Marxist historiography in that. So that would be the little answer. I hope that I make some sense to your question.
Thank you, sir. Sir, thank you for such an enlightening answer, sir. Sir, my another question will be, uh, can you throw some light on how ecastology plays its role while we analyze Vedic age through ecastological lens?
Uh, you know, uh, I think it's very important. Scatology is not something. Somewhere, one may say that when you have a society which is a lot of forms, is a continuity in practices, then we can say that there is some form that always existing. So it's something like that. It is not an immediate history. If human consciousness, if we take, one way it is very important that how one shapes the consciousness. After all, when we say Vedic history and Vedic ages, it is also we inquire through the idea of consciousness. So when we say that what exactly creates them, so any eschatology or eschatology and other aspects of discussion that has been done, particularly in religious lens, if with this sense, it appears to be that it is just happened in few centuries ago, because in consciousness there is some sort of a continuity in that. But we know that there are thousands of years of gap between current and that. It is only through the some sort of a ritual and some sort of a practices and some sort of a geographical limitations in which these remain some sort of in continuity in practices, despite there were different dimensions were attached to it, whether colonial time or pre-colonial time. We find that somewhere that consciousness has been in a way there is continuity, and whatever the process of discontinuity that really has happened, we also have some sort of a claritical understanding on that. Religion, in one way, is a very important and religious some sort of ideas, whether through practices, through chanting some sort of slokas, in rituals, in some sort of social practices for that matter, in marriages, and even in among the various sections of Indian society, the thread practices which they call some sort of upana and sanskara and all that. So the idea of a sanskara and all that, it's a deep rooted in consciousness, and that's why somehow the religious past and its current, it looks very much a very recent idea, because of how different societies, which is somehow continuing, had tried to pass it over to another society. This cannot be discussed in a very Western idea, where the pre and the post Christian history had a complete different, and after the post Enlightenment, it is a completely different. So there is a complete rupture. What we see here, in particular in larger Indian society, despite there is a lot of rupture, the consciousness remained very much rooted in different ways. One way say can challenge that whatever scatology and other expressions of consciousness we talk about, these are sort of providing justifications in which a particular set of order has survived. But we know that religion is not just about societal order. Its expressions comes with different sort of mode, and all those modes of different expressions, we try to look into the religion. And religion is basically is not just about practices. It's also about the human history. Religion is a very important lens in how human history has progressed. So, if we say that the historical overview of the past, religion and its religion expression, the consciousness, the idea of eschatology, and consciousness of other aspect, provides some sort of identity of the human reality. It is also about human history. So, in that way, I try to look into how that, particularly the aspect of religion and religiosity, really matters when we inquire about Vedic system and Vedic ages. And a small answer would be the look around and go into the major villages and some of the practices, and you will find that in terms of language, in terms of some sort of practices, there is a continuity in there. If you go to museums anywhere, and if you find the kind of vessels are used, still in larger section of southern India in particular, you will find that those vessels which is made of pot is still in practices. Similarly in rituals, similarly in some sort of a discussions in practices and some sort of rituals, there is a continuity. So in a deeper consciousness, religion has somehow sort of a connected meaning about the Vedic history and present. When we try to see it from historical point of view, then it is a sort of a different ruptures comes in. When it comes to the religious practices and other, there is some sort of a very immediate connection that you can find out. So that's a little that I can make response to that.
So my third question will be another liberty I am taking for my chair. So my third question will be, so don't you think that while we are analyzing our past, that is, be it ancient or any history for that matter, uh, if we are looking from a colonial lens, why this is a tendency to look at the condition of the woman first and then everything afterwards? Means this feminist tendencies, why they are so? Because our civilization has been a great civilization, and women's were there was many women scientists, architects, engineers, and
I think you have lost. Can you hear me? Dr. Koza, are you still there or anyone else? Are you there? Come in. Hello. Okay, because I have a meeting at 2:15. No, it's already 2:13 now. So please, yeah, yeah, sure, please.
basically, I'm extremely sorry for this technical glitch. So I will be just sort of concluding. Thank you, sir, for enlightening us so much on this issue and sparing up time. And it was an extremely informative presentation on your side, sir. And you have covered it ontologically, astrologically, and epistemologically. And also have you have told us how this widespread burden theory is playing a crucial role in our historiographic tools, especially when we are looking at Vedic age and other ages as well. So thank you, sir, so much for being with us. Thank you so much, sir. With this I conclude, sir. Thank you,
Thank
the
you.
chair.
Thank you
Thank you, sir.
for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Should I leave now, or is there anything left from my side?
No, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity and your team. I mean, it's really wonderful to be here and talk on such an important topic. Thank you.
Thank
Wish
you.
you all good luck. Bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.